We're going to be in 1 Samuel 19. 1 Samuel chapter 19. Hopefully, we're familiar with at least some of these accounts from 19. We're in a period of time where Saul is becoming increasingly antagonistic toward David. His mental health is deteriorating, Saul's is. David's popularity is on the increase, and not just among the outsiders, but among the insiders in the royal family, in the religious part of the community. David is by far more popular than Saul at this point, and so his jealousy is leading him to try to get rid of David, to try to bolster his own ego. So I want us to read all of 19. 19 and 20 are connected. There's several stories in 19 and then continues in 20 with the same line, but we just don't have time to do all of it tonight. Lord willing, we'll pick that up with the next session. But we'll start reading in chapter 19, verse 1. Notice the separation, the disconnect between Saul and members of his family in particular, and then outsiders as well. Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. But Jonathan had taken a great liking to David and warned him, "My father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on guard tomorrow morning. Go into hiding and stay there, and I will go out and stand with my father in the field where you are. I'll speak to him about you, and then I'll tell you what I find out." Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and said to him, "Let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you, and what he has done has benefited you greatly. He took his life in his hands when he killed the Philistine. The Lord won a great victory for all of Israel, and you saw it, and you were glad. Why then would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason?" Saul listened to Jonathan and took this oath, "As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death." I'm going to read that one again. As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. So Jonathan called David, told him the whole conversation, and brought him to Saul. And David was with Saul as before. Once more, war broke out. David went out and fought the Philistines. He struck them with such force that they fled before him. But an evil spirit from the Lord came on Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand, while David was playing the lyre. Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear, but David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. That night, David made good his escape. Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and to kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, parentheses, Saul's daughter, warned him, "If you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed." So Michal let David down through a window, and he fled and escaped. Then Michal took an idol and laid it in the bed, covering it with a garment and putting some goat's hair at the head. When Saul sent the men to capture David, Michal said, "He's ill." Then Saul sent the men back to see David and told them, "Bring him up to me in his bed so that I may kill him." But when the men entered, there was the idol in the bed, and at the head was some goat's hair. Saul said to Michal, "Why did you deceive me like this and send my enemy away so that he escaped?" Michal said to him, "He said to me, 'Let me get away. Why should I kill you?'" When David had fled and made his escape, he went to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. Then he and Samuel went to Naioth and stayed there. Word came to Saul, "David is at Naioth at Ramah." So he sent men to capture him. But when they saw a group of prophets prophesying, with Samuel standing there as their leader, the Spirit of God came on Saul's men, and they also prophesied. Saul was told about it, and he sent more men, and they prophesied too. Saul sent men a third time. They also prophesied. Finally, he himself left for Ramah and went to the great cistern at Seku. And he asked, "Where is Samuel and where is David?" "Over in Naioth at Ramah," they said. So Saul went to Naioth at Ramah, but the Spirit of God came even on him. And he walked along prophesying until he came to Naioth. He stripped off his garments, and he too prophesied in Samuel's presence. He lay naked all that day and all that night. And this is why people say, is Saul also among the prophets? And I want to give you a bonus couple of verses. Look at chapter 20, verse 1 and 2. Starts almost the same way as 19. David fled from Naioth at Ramah and went to Jonathan and asked, "What have I done? What is my crime? Have I wronged my father that he's trying to kill me?" "Never," Jonathan replied. "You are not going to die. Look, my father doesn't do anything, great or small, without letting me know. Why would he hide this from me? It can't be so." So you see the shift in family relations, the shift in relations among Saul's staff, his daughter, Samuel. There's all kinds of intrigue going on. So I want to spend some time kind of reminding ourselves of a few things. First of all, Saul is not in charge of his own faculties at this point. He is suffering from his own problems, and then added to that from time to time, God is sending this evil spirit on Saul, which drives him to madness. And then the second thing, David has great connections in the royal family in particular. So he's married to a daughter of Saul. He's best friends with Saul's son, and really a great war hero, Jonathan. Everybody looked up to Jonathan, perhaps even more so than to Saul. All right. So Jonathan has insider knowledge about the king's affairs, at least at the beginning of 19. Right? He hears what Saul is saying. He's out to get David, and he goes and tells David. By the time we get to 20, Saul has figured out that Jonathan can't be trusted with this information. And so he's keeping Jonathan out of the loop, and David ends up having to tell Jonathan that his dad is out to get him. But Jonathan loves David more than he loves his father. Isn't that something? Here's the question. Why? I think he sees in David someone who still has a firm grasp of reality, someone who has a strong moral compass, so that even the connectedness of being father and son kind of gets set aside because Saul isn't doing what's right. When Jonathan gives him that speech in 19, why would you do something like this to an innocent man? In other words, you're being unfair. Your rule over the people is inadequate. You're making bad decisions. Why would you do this sort of thing? And he sees in David someone who is going to do what they say they're going to do, who is loyal. Notice that Saul takes this oath. And after he's taken the oath, it only takes him a couple of battles of David doing well for him to change his mind about the oath. So, again, Jonathan sees in David someone with a strong moral compass. He sees in his dad somebody that's not making good decisions. I wanted to reread that verse, and I'll read it to you again. "As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death." I think that Saul was simply making a strong statement on his own behalf, but it ends up being prophetic. I don't think, there's no indication, at least in this verse, that Saul is prophesying. But what he says is true. He said, what he meant was, I'm not going to kill him. What he said was, he's not going to die. So Saul continuously tries to kill David, and this is going to go on for months. But God protects David, so it ends up being a true statement, even though Saul is not the one that makes it true. The second person you have to look at is Michal. And there's a couple of interesting questions, at least for me, when it comes to Michal. Somebody raised the not objection, but the fact, I guess it was Jerry, last week, that we're talking about the guy who eventually goes and finds Bathsheba and commits adultery against Michal. So Michal is more dedicated to David at times than David is to her. But on this occasion, she does exactly what she has to do. And again, she sees something in David that she likes better than what she sees in her own dad. She wants to circumvent the king's orders and keep her husband alive, keep David alive. And we're told before they ever get married that she was in love with David early on. So this is her childhood sweetheart, so to speak. This is her idol, and she's married the man that she loved, and she wants to keep him safe. So we're told that she takes an idol and puts it in the bed. So question number one, why do we have an idol at David and Michal's house? That's odd. In this time frame, they're fighting against the Philistines, so I'm going to figure it's not Dagon. But the leading idol that might have showed up about that time in Israel would have been Baal or Asherah. We have no idea who this idol is. It's not identified, and it's taken for granted that it was there. You remember when Jacob was leaving Laban's, and he takes his wives, and they leave Laban's house, and Rachel steals her father's idols and carries them along with them. They just pop up like that. People just have idols in their houses, and they're God-fearers, God-worshippers, at least to some degree, but then somehow the idol shows up, and she puts an idol in his bed. So first of all, she lies about David's health, and this one I always find kind of funny. She tells the men who have come to kill David, he's sick. Okay? That makes him easier to kill, yes? Go into his room and kill the guy. If you're going to, if that's your job is to go kill David, the fact that he's sick shouldn't stop you from killing him. They go back to Saul and say, we can't kill him, he's sick. And Saul says, well, go get his bed and just bring him to me and I'll kill him. So kind of, I don't know if we're looking at incompetence on the part of these guys or just a real unwillingness to hurt David. They didn't want the job. They didn't want to kill David. If they're soldiers, then they fought with David and they've seen what David could do. He's a tremendous warrior. They liked David. He was very popular. So the command to go kill David could not have been a very welcome assignment for any of them. But again, so she hides, puts an idol in the bed and puts some goat hair on it, and they fall for it. When they get back, they find out that she's done this, and her answer to her dad is interesting. David made me do it. Right? He threatened me. He said, why should I have to kill you? Right? Just let me go run away, or I'll have to kill you. So in Saul's mind, that's not going to help David's case. Right? Now he's threatened to kill my daughter. That's not going to slow me down from wanting to kill the guy. But she was able to get him out safely and able to move her dad in the wrong direction. And then we get to Samuel. Right? So we've had Jonathan, Saul's son, heir apparent to the throne. We've had Michal, his daughter, married to David. And now we get to Samuel. One of the problems we've had with Saul's kingship is that he's brought in the wrong group to be his leaders. And he has the grandsons of Eli serving as his priests. So when he sends men to go find David and they end up prophesying in front of Samuel, that doesn't change his mind. That should have been a big hint that maybe we should just call the whole thing off. Maybe I should just go meet with Samuel and find out what I need to do. Maybe I should ask the Lord what I need to do. He does none of those things. He just keeps sending guys. So he sends the first group, they end up prophesying. He sends the second group, they end up prophesying. He sends the third group, they end up prophesying. If you're in your right mind, you figure by this time, maybe I need to leave this alone. Saul's not in his right mind. Saul is overcome with jealousy and hatred, and so he decides that he will just go by himself and take care of this. When he finally finds Samuel, evidently he doesn't ever get to contact David, but when he gets in touch with Samuel, he begins to prophesy. Is this the first time that Saul has prophesied? No, this is at least the second time. when he was first anointed. You remember all those places he was supposed to go, and he'd run into this group that was coming down, and he'd run into this group that was coming down. One of those groups that was coming down from a high place was a group of prophets, and Saul falls in with them and prophesies. So we've got Saul is being influenced spiritually on a regular basis, sometimes by good spirits, sometimes by bad spirits. But at this point, we have to assume it's the same spirit that was making the prophets prophesy. So he's overcome by the Spirit of God. He prophesies all day and all night. The NIV says, now let me get the right wording here. He stripped off his garments, and he too prophesied in Samuel's presence. He lay naked all that day and all that night. And that's why the people say, is Saul also among the prophets? Looked at a few sources, and some of them say what we're talking about is that he just took off his outer garments and still had that one-piece undergarment that they wore in those days. And then some say, well, no, it says naked, and it means naked. If you are Saul, and you have revolted against Samuel, and your main objective on this trip is to kill David, and you end up prophesying in such a fashion, whether you're in your underwear or whether you're naked, in front of Samuel, you are being humbled. God is saying to you, you're on the wrong path, doing the wrong thing, and I want to remind you who's in charge here. So the prophecy is unimportant. We don't have any idea what he prophesied about or what he might have said. The fact that he was unclothed is important, but the most important thing is that he's humbled in front of Samuel. This has been going back and forth now for quite a few months. At the beginning, the people said, we want a king. And Samuel goes to God, and he's upset. God says, remember, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. Now I want you to go and find Saul, and I want you to anoint him. And he does all of that as God tells him to do. And it's not long before Saul gets so full of himself that he starts doing things instead of Samuel, and eventually just excludes Samuel altogether. So Samuel's over here at Ramah, and he is really the leading authority in Jewish religion. He's the leading authority. He's God's man in Israel. And Saul's just got him excluded. But when God keeps putting his ambassadors into the line of prophets until Saul finally goes himself, God humbles Saul, puts him on the ground, and says, this is my representative. Samuel is my guy, and you're going to be there until you figure that out. So he just humbles him, sets him down. I was talking to Becky about this afternoon, and she said, well, is that the guy that had to eat grass? I said, no, but it's the same idea, right? Nebuchadnezzar ends up having to eat grass like an animal for a while because he gets too full of himself. Sometimes God just steps in, takes over the deal, changes a mindset, and makes somebody humble. And he had to do that with Saul to get him off of David's trail. Is this going to be the end of it? No, we're not even to chapter 20 yet. Chapter 20 is going to be more of the same. Saul wants to get rid of David so that he can have that comfortable leadership that he had in the beginning. It's not going to happen. God's always going to take care of David, and he's always going to humble King Saul. Any questions about any of that? How many of you knew all of that chapter? You're familiar with all of those stories? No, it's new to you? Well, good. Good. It's with Saul and David, you're looking at the very beginnings of the Israelite monarchy, and then you're looking at the best of the Israelite monarchy. David was one of the best kings that they ever had. He's in company with guys like Josiah and Hezekiah, folks that just listened to the voice of God and did what God called them to do, that humbled themselves before God, as opposed to guys like Saul, who tried to do what they thought was the thing to do and had to be taken down a notch or two. That'll preach. Let me preach for about 20 seconds. In our lives, we've got two choices. We can look to Scripture, and we can see what God wants us to do and do that. Or we can look to ourselves and decide for ourselves what we think is the thing to do. Unfortunately, in James he says, if you'll humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, he will lift you up. The opposite is also true. If you exalt yourself in the sight of the Lord, he will bring you down. So God's name is to be praised, his word is to be followed, and the sooner we learn that and the more fervently we follow that in our lives, the better our lives will be. If you need to respond to the invitation, we'd love to help you as we stand and sing.